Prime Minister Mulroney was a true bipartisan leader.
He was a cohesive force in our country, I think, and he kept his dignity even through, divisive times.
His leadership style is probably something that'll be, studied as much as his empathy and generosity.
Politics aside, it was hard not to like the guy, eh? If you spent more than 5 minutes with him anytime, you felt like you had a new best friend.
You see pictures of him, he's sort of full of glee, meeting world leaders and having an impact on them.
He was a decision maker and an even-handed leader. I would take Brian Mulroney back today.
Good morning. You're watching CBC News Network. You are joining us on CBC Gem, and we have special live coverage this morning of the lying in repose of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Canada's 18th Prime Minister from 1984 to 1993. You're looking here live inside St. Patrick's Basilica in Montreal, this beautiful church, the very heart of the Irish community in Montreal. March the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1847. It was opened. It has hosted many notable occasions over the years since. Today will be another. And there you can see the preparations for the arrival of the funeral cortege. At the front of the church, a portrait of Brian Mulroney. You see the RCMP getting set to be providing that honorary detail, and the final preparations. The casket, the funeral cortege set to arrive very soon, and Brian Mulroney will lie in repose in this place throughout today and tomorrow. We will be live this morning as the casket arrives, as his family follows to receive condolences from dignitaries and from Canadians and Quebecers saying farewell to one of Canada's most consequential leaders. There will be friends, there will be colleagues, there will be members of the public, and we know we had seen long lineups. They previously paid tribute to Mulroney in Ottawa, of course, where he lay in state for the past 2 days. Sarah Levitt is part of our coverage team. She's outside St. Patrick's on what is a pretty cold morning there in Montreal. I hope that doesn't dissuade mourners, Sarah, those who want to pay respects. What are we going to see in just a matter of minutes?
Well, the family, the Mulroney family, has made their way from Ottawa to here in Montreal. They should be here in the next 20 minutes or so alongside the casket. We're going to see a lot of the same type of ceremony that we saw in Ottawa here at St. Patrick Basilica. That means the casket draped in the Canadian flag with RCMP pallbearers bringing the casket inside where they'll be greeted by the Reverend inside, the minister, who will perform a prayer, family following behind. And of course, there will be those sentinels, as they call them, the people part of the RCMP, Mounties, as well as Canadian Armed Forces, who will watch over the casket as it lies in repose in this church. And Brian Mulroney was known as a great Irish Canadian. He had ties, his family had ties to this church. And as you said, the church really the heart of the Irish community here in Montreal. But he was also known as a great Quebecer, and he was born in Baie-Comeau on the North Shore of this province. He was fluently bilingual, and he made lots of great connections here that helped him propel him into his political career. And so we will see some dignitaries come and pay their respects. We're expecting former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, to come. And Charest has said that Mulroney was, to him, the greatest prime minister that Canada has ever had. He had a chance, Charest, to see Mulroney before he died, just a few days before he went to visit him in Florida. He said that he called him my mentor, my father figure, the man that made me learn about leadership. So he's expected here today among the dignitaries and the friends that will come pay their respects.
And we will be watching, as all of them do, and you, of course, talking to them as they arrive. And I hope that we can get some more of the anecdotes. Sarah, it's been so impressive to hear people's personal connections, encounters they had with Brian Mulroney. I was just thinking the years that I lived and worked in Montreal, I would see him just walking the streets of Montreal, following his political years. And it was always so striking to me that there was no security detail. He was citizen of Montreal, and that was a part of the story as well. Many people who are going to be in that line.
And if I may, I just want to say that in Baie-Comeau, you know, it's a very small town. It was established by an Irish person, but it's very, very French now. But he kept up with the people there. CBC spoke with someone who still lives there and said, you know, every birthday, Brian Mulroney would write me an email or give me a call to say happy birthday. So that just shows you the level of connection that Mulroney continued to have with people from his hometown. But we are, as you said, hearing these anecdotes all over.
You know, everyone talked about this transcendent ability to make friends and to keep friends, and we're going to talk about that with one of his longest friends in just a couple of minutes. But I do want to ask about that because I know you'll be listening to people's stories of crossing his path and what he meant to them as a leader of this country. What is the expectation in terms of turnout and what you'll see and hear from Quebecers today, Sarah?
Well, as you said, it is probably the coldest day that we've had all winter, which is quite remarkable for end of March. So we're unsure if that will have an effect on the crowds, but we do expect to see a similar outing as what we saw in Ottawa. People wanting to come out and pay their respects and maybe get a chance for me to hear their stories. The expectation today is that from noon until 6 they can come. Of course, there is a lot of security that they have to go through, but they come from 12 to 6 today and 10 to 6 tomorrow. Inside there is a book of condolences where they can also pay their respects. And for those who can't make it here and want to pay their respects, there is a book of condolences online that Canadians and anybody can go and write what they want about their memories of Brian Mulroney. So all of this, of course, leading up to Saturday, which is the funeral. He will remain, the casket will remain here in St. Patrick Basilica until Saturday morning, when they will lead the casket to the Notre Dame Basilica for the official funeral of Brian Mulroney.
Sarah, thank you. I'm just going to pause our conversation for now, and we'll be back to you as we continue with special live coverage. We're looking there as we look inside St. Patrick's Basilica, and you can see that there is a portrait of Brian Mulroney as a younger man, and you're going to meet somebody now who knew him then and even before then. He's had a most illustrious career, formerly one of the foremost courtroom lawyers in Canada, and now one of the top arbitrators in international commercial matters. He first met Brian Mulroney back in the 1960s as young lawyers, and they were fast friends for all the years that followed. Yves Fortier is in London this morning. He's arbitrating a case right now. He's got 15 minutes for me before he has to go back and handle that. But tomorrow he will board a plane and return home for his friend's state funeral. Monsieur Fortier, what a pleasure to have you on our program today. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope my plane is on time tomorrow.
You'll be tight to get there in time for the many recollections and commemorations. There'll be many hours on that plane, Monsieur Fortier, and you'll have time to reflect, time for reminiscences. Where do you think your mind will go?
I've done little else since the 29th of February.
Tell me about that. What is on your mind?
What is on my mind? Well, I've lost a dear friend, as you've mentioned. He rang the doorbell in our office back in 1963,
Just bear with me for one moment, Monsieur Fortier.
My juniors, gophers, go for this, go for that. We had a lot in common, a great deal in common, not political things, yes, but not politics. If you know what I mean.
I was going to say, he always said your only flaw was that you're a lifelong liberal, and of course he a conservative, and yet such great friends.
I remember after my 4 years at the UN. And we were having an informal discussion, and he very generously said, Eve, you did a great job. And I said, well, the moral of the story, Brian, is if you want good services rendered by Canadians in international circles, appoint Liberals.
Which he did. Let's remind people of that, because people might not know. In 1988, he appointed you as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. He was famous for phone calls, and before you go, I want to talk about the last phone call you had. But on this point, he was famous for phone calls. So I'm thinking about the late 80s and on to the 90s, when he has appointed you Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. What must those phone calls have been discussing? Can you share? You were there at seismic moments in global history, and you shared them with him.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I shared them with him, and he shared them with me. The telephone was not invented by, Graham Bell. It was invented by and for Brian Mulroney. I remember one of the many things he told me when he approached me to go to New York was, I don't want a career politician. Canada has a good chance of being elected on the Security Council. There'll be a lot of large-scale issues which will come up. I want someone seated at the Security Council table whom I know very well, and that I can speak to at any hour of the day or night. And he was true to his word, much to my wife's dismay. On occasion, the phone would ring, literally at 5 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock at night. And Eve, wait, say Brian. Okay. And there was a particular issue that he wanted me to bring up with the Secretary General, or that he wanted me to discuss with some of my colleagues on the Security Council. He was so much well informed. It's truly amazing the knowledge which he had, whether it was about apartheid and the role of the Commonwealth, whether it was the role of a place for Quebec in the Francophonie, you name it. He was. And he was sought. He was always continuously sought. I remember during the first Gulf War, and he was invited by President Bush to go to the White House. And he asked me to go with him, and as Derek Burney was our man, our ambassador at the UN, at the U.S., and at the end of the question and answer, there was a journalist. I won't name him. I'll be careful, because you probably know him. A journalist from Toronto, with almost disdain in his voice, said, "Mr. Prime Minister, can you tell me what you're doing here?" And I can still hear President Bush say, "Brian, let me answer that question." And he said, I invited Prime Minister Mulroney to come to Washington. This is a very important issue which is going on in the Gulf countries. I wanted his advice. I value his advice. End of exchange. Brian, let's go in.
Let's go in.
He was, yeah.
To be able to have watched him on the world stage, I guess you take the phone call, sir, when it comes in, regardless of the hour, when it's about the fall of the Berlin Wall or any of the matters with which you were engaged at that time. I would like people to know, we didn't know this until Mr. Mulroney's memoirs came out, that he asked you to be ambassador after you turned him down, that he originally had sought you to be on the Supreme Court as one of the justices there, but you said no. Now, how did that conversation go?
Well, I wish he had never written that in his memoirs, and I assure you that this is not something that I would have spoken about had it not been for the fact that he wrote it. I was, needless to say, I was very honored, very flattered by his offer, particularly since it meant replacing a dear friend, Julien, Mr. Justice Chouinard, Julien Chouinard, whom I knew very well, in fact was at Oxford with me. No, very simply put, it's being a judge was not in my ADN. Living in Ottawa, no harm, no pun intended, with 8 other persons that I have not chosen. That was not for me. That was not for me. So I thanked him profusely, and I turned his invitation down. And he said, well, I'll get you something one of these days. I said, well, Brian, I'm very happy practicing law in your old law firm. I'm very happy. I'm a litigator. I've got fascinating cases. But when I came back from the UN, I didn't want to go back to doing too many cases, trials. I thought maybe doing in arbitration would be a way of having all of the advantages of being a judge and none of the disadvantages. A lot of travel, meeting a lot of very, very good lawyers, sitting with the la crème de la crème, some of the best lawyers in Singapore, in London, in Paris. So to this day, I do not regret my decision. I do not regret my decision, and I'm extremely grateful for the Prime Minister, for Brian, for having found something that did appeal to me. How about New York? Oh,
okay.
that was different. That was different.
Consequential to you personally and so influential, and I guess a turning point, which has led you in so many ways on the global stage and in which you continue to have a spectacular career. I want to talk, if you would, about one of your phone calls, in fact, one in particular, the last one, as it turned out, prior to his death. And I know you've talked a little bit about this publicly in another interview I was reading just this morning, but when you spoke to him in Florida just a little while before his passing, can you share some of that conversation?
Yeah, this was a private conversation, obviously, like every conversation that I had with Brian. We spoke about every week, but it was generally on weekends. He kidded me you're still working, you stupid Eve. Like if I'm sure he's looking at me now saying, typical. A very important week, and here's Eve in London, but not surprised. Anyway, on the Monday before he passed away, at an unusual hour, dinner time. It was around 7 in the evening, and Cal, my wife, and I were seated down. And the phone rang, and hello, Yves. By the way, we alternated between French and English, as you know. His French was perfect. Yeah, voilà. And my English is passable. But hello, Yves. How are you? Oh, Brian. What's new? Oh, no, nothing much. Are you still in Palm Beach? Yes, still in Palm Beach. And when I learned 3 days later that he had passed away, I dramatized that conversation, maybe in a way that I should not have dramatized, because when it happened, it was not bonjour, it was not au revoir. It was, okay, we'll speak next weekend. Give me a call or I'll give you a call. But in retrospect, I was trying to. I wish I had recorded that call. He told me, he said something towards the end of the conversation that registered with me and will remain with me forever. He said, and this was in French, he said, say, Yves, je t'aime beaucoup. You know, Yves, I love you very much. As I said, I can dramatize and put some interpretation on those words, but I did not at the time. At the time, it was, "Bonsoir, Brian. We'll talk next weekend." But it brings tears to my eyes even at this moment.
Understandably. You know, I was thinking and listening to your story, so much has been written about his incredible capacity for friendship. And as I mentioned, yours lasted for 60 years. What was it that was so special, and why your friendship endured as it did?
How much time do you have? We had a lot of things in common. He loved hockey. As a matter of fact, he took one of my daughters to her first hockey game. She was a fan of, to this day, continues to be a fan of the Habs, the Montreal Canadiens, and she was about, I don't know, 10 or 11, and he came to our house on Arlington and picked her up. Her first date, and they went to a hockey game, and every time, I'm not exaggerating, almost every time he spoke to me, he would inquire about Susie. How's Susie? How's Suzanne? And Susie went through a difficult divorce recently. There was he called her. Never mind going through me. He would call her to find out how she was. Now, he had that knack. He didn't want anybody to be unhappy. He wanted people around him to be smiling. He wanted people around him to be happy. And I'm sure he never thought of phoning someone so that that person could say, "Oh, guess what? I received a call from the former Prime Minister." I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, I was having lunch with a former partner at my old firm, who left the firm under difficult circumstances. So we were having lunch. And he said, "Guess what, Yves?" I won't name him. Mm-hmm. Guess what? Guess who called me the other day? I said, "Brian?" He said, "How did you guess?" I said, "I was certain you were going to say that Brian Mulroney called you, because that's the sort of thing that he did." You know, he wasn't particularly close to this person, but he wanted that person to know that he was thinking about him. Sending flowers to wives of some of the people who worked for him. André Tellier, Paul Tellier's, Paul, former private secretary to the Prime Minister. There'd be flowers to André on every one of her birthday. If he learned that someone had lost a relative, he would phone. If only he had met every Canadian one-on-one, I've often said that, he would have been Prime Minister of Canada for life. But this was not made up. This was not made up. He was genuinely nice.
Mr. Fortier, that is such a beautiful thought. You would have Prime Minister for life, and Paul Tellier, I think we're going to see outside in the Basilica. I think he said that was the best boss he ever had, Mr. Mulroney, and that's part of the story. Yeah. In the spirit of your bilingual, bicultural friendship and friend, j'ai tellement apprécié vos souvenirs. Merci infiniment, monsieur. I really appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure to spend time with you. But I know you have to get back to business, and there's a big hearing underway. So I will let you go for that.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous,
beaucoup pour
and we will
l'invitation.
see you as you make that flight. I hope you're not delayed. You will not want to miss this very important moment. Thank you so much, sir.
Of course. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Merci à vous. Yves Fortier, as we speak from London, Brian Mulroney's great lifetime friend. Outside St. Patrick's Basilica in Montreal, as we look live here at the place where Brian Mulroney is going to lie in repose for 2 days. Now, Monsieur Fortier was talking about meeting him as a young lawyer. They both worked at the firm, what was Ogilvy Renault originally, it became Norton Rose and is now Norton Rose Fulbright. And someone we met earlier this morning is now the Canadian chair of that law firm. And as we watch the live pictures coming in a little bit later on, when the dignitaries and invited guests begin to arrive, he will be leading a whole delegation of partners and associates from the firm to pay respects to what he called on the air with us, the leader, the most significant lawyer for 60 years at Norton Rose Fulbright. So that is Walid Solomon. And let's share a little bit of what he told us earlier this morning.
To allocate sort of representation from the firm, and our managing partner and I were talking about it. There would be 500 people from this firm that would gladly stand in line and pay their respects and be there. We've put together a really quite a beautiful contingent of partners, existing partners of the firm, and former partners, people that love Brian Mulroney and love his family and who he's touched. And they're coming back here to Montreal, some of them traveling from across the country. And it's going to be a beautiful moment. It's going to be a really beautiful, private moment where I think, as colleagues of his, we're going through our own grieving. And being there is going to be pretty special.
Walid Solomon, who is the chair in Canada of Norton Rose Fulbright, a mentor, a mentee. Brian Mulroney was his mentor. He knew them for some 30 years, 20 years as a law colleague, and he talked about the incredible wisdom, the incredible advice that Brian Mulroney dispensed to him and to all of the other legal colleagues in the office, and especially to the youngest lawyers. We were reminiscing about, he was with me about what it was like for those years when Brian Mulroney would be in the office and would be in the halls and dominating presence, of course, for those in the firm who knew him and had such respect for him. So we will watch for Walid to lead that Norton Rose Fulbright as among the invited guests a little bit later on. Now, we're looking live at the streets of Montreal here. And we are going to see very shortly. We do have a number of reporters from our CBC bureau in Montreal. We're thankful that they're able to join us this morning. But awaiting scenes of the funeral cortege. He left Ottawa yesterday, the cortege driving to Montreal in a funeral home overnight, and this morning making its way there to St. Patrick's. Now, watching all of this with me in Ottawa is David Cochrane. He's the host of Power and Politics, of course, part of our original special as Brian Mulroney began to lie in state in Ottawa, and he'll be with you on Saturday, I know, for the state funeral. David, I'm just delighted to have you with us as well. And what we're going to see, David, today in Montreal, it's just called something different, lying in repose as opposed to lying in state, but it's going to look very similar. So why don't you, based on what you've been witnessing and covering these past days, tell us what we're in for today?
Well, if it's anything like what we saw here in Ottawa, Heather, you will see a remarkable feat of endurance and pride by the Mulroney family. Mila Mulroney and her 4 children and some of their spouses stood for hours across 2 days without breaks to shake the hands of every diplomat, dignitary, politician, and ordinary Canadian who showed up at the Sir John A. Macdonald building here in Ottawa to say goodbye to their husband and their father and to Canada's 18th Prime Minister. And anyone who's ever had to do that, at a funeral for a loved one knows the emotional weight and strain you're carrying in that. But they decided, Mark Mulroney told our Rosemary Barton that it was Mila Mulroney who said, people waited for hours to come in and see your father. We're going to stand there and we're going to greet them. And they were all proud and happy to do it. And it was a remarkable thing to just watch the live feed all day and see them there right until the very end when Brian Mulroney's casket was taken and put into the hearse to begin the journey to where we're going to show the end of it now as he arrives at the cathedral in Montreal. But he did one last circuit around the road network that is on Parliament Hill, driving under the Peace Tower where the flags flew at half-staff, a final farewell, they call it, to the building and to the city where he reigned supreme as Canada's Prime Minister for 9 years, from 1984 to 1993. And all week, Heather, I've been struck by kind of this mingling of this public process and public procedure to say goodbye to a Prime Minister of substantial consequence, mingle with that intimate farewell from family, to say goodbye to a husband, to a father, and to a grandfather, and to a father-in-law, and how that all blends together. A guy who served the public throughout most of his career and lived his life in public, now these final moments also being shared in a very public way that his family has gotten quite used to, I would say, over the course of their lives.
You know, we're looking now, we're getting, David, the very first look at the funeral cortege, and my understanding is there was a similar sort of procession through the streets of Montreal, too. A final farewell from Ottawa. There may be one following this, but as the cortege is now arriving at St. Patrick's Basilica, which is right downtown, René Lévesque, right in the center of downtown. It wasn't when it was built the center of Montreal, but it has become as the city has grown and changed. And there is the motorcade. There will be 3 family vehicles, we understand, and then the hearse will drive up. And of course, we will be watching as that very special moment occurs. But it's interesting, David, I don't know, I've been struck as you've been listening to people talk about wait to pay their respects. As I look at the streets of Montreal, I was telling Sarah when I used to live there and work there, it didn't happen often, but I was always struck. You'd see Brian Mulroney walking the streets of Montreal as a citizen, part of the city he loves so much, a proud Quebecer, of course, proud Montrealer. And I was always struck by that lack of security detail and going about his normal life. And people who have been speaking in Ottawa talked about they'd see him in different places in sort of the same sort of context, or they'd run into him unexpectedly on Parliament Hill. We've had all sorts of wonderful stories about that.
Yeah, that's sort of the random nature of life here when you work in political Ottawa in particular. You know, there's 2 Ottawas, right? There's political and official Ottawa, and then there's Ottawa proper. And it's a bit like I live and work in the Disneyland part of the city and everyone else works in Orlando. You know, it's that kind of division. And, you know, you just go out for a coffee and run into Jean Chrétien or a former cabinet minister and these sorts of things. And it's a normal part. It's becoming increasingly rare as the security situation changes for politicians and as politics gets angrier, more toxic, and security becomes more of a concern. But those stories kind of harken back to this, I don't know, easier time, Heather, where people were still angry about things, but politicians just felt more comfortable being out and talking to ordinary people.
David, we're just going to pause because the hearse has arrived. You can hear the bells of St. Patrick's. I will tell you, this is going to be met by the Monsignor, the pastor of the church, as well as the Archbishop of Montreal and a representative from Notre Dame. You can see the family as they exit the family vehicles, those 3 family vehicles. Caroline, his daughter, Ben, Mark, and Nicholas, the 3 sons, and of course Mila, his wife of more than 50 years. And there is the family gathering. And I think, David, we'll just pause for a moment and watch as this part unfolds. As we look at live pictures from Montreal, and there is the Mulroney family. the center of Brian Mulroney's universe. And we've heard, David, over and over from the children, quite remarkable stories about how obviously knew their father was doing great things. I mean, Nicholas was born at 24 Sussex, and they were all so young at the time. But they would phone him. You know, we talked so much today about Brian Mulroney being on the phone. Yves Fortier said Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone for Brian Mulroney. But many of those calls came in from his children. And it didn't matter if he was meeting with world leaders at a G7. He took their call, and he always made them feel special. You must have heard a lot about his family tie and the closeness of the Mulroney family in the past couple of days.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing to hear. Like, I've covered some of these international summits, right? G7s, NATO, all of these things. You travel to them and you just get swept up in the weight of it, the urgency of it, and the power of it. But he always made time for his kids when they wanted to call, and they're making time for him, obviously, on a day like today.
So, David, this is a sacred moment. Let's just pause together and we will watch. Again, the casket of Brian Mulroney, Canada's 18th Prime Minister, with his family standing to pay their respects. Royal Canadian Mounted Police bearer party will carry the casket through the main door of the Basilica, and we will together pause and watch.
Yeah, perfect.
will of him who sent me is that I choose to lose nothing, all that he has given to me, and that I shall raise it up on the last day. Yes, it's my Father's will that whoever sees the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, that I shall raise him up on the last day. And in baptism, Brian shared in the death and resurrection of Christ. May he be welcomed into the glory of eternal life. And together we will say the prayer of Brian Mulroney on the knees of his mom. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Almighty God and Father, it is our certain faith that your Son, who died on the cross, was raised from the dead, the first fruits of all who have fallen asleep. Grant that through this mystery your servant Brian, who has gone to his rest in Christ, may share in the joy of the resurrection. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Blessed are those who have died in the Lord. Let them rest from their labors, for their good deeds go with them. Eternal rest grant on Brian, the Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. And may he rest in peace. And may his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, in the mercy of God, rest in peace. And may the peace of God, which is beyond all our understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of the Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. And may Almighty God bless the family, the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Just follow me in Lord, please.
You're watching live coverage of Brian Mulroney as he arrives, the funeral cortege at St. Patrick's Basilica for the lying in repose for the next couple of days. And we do have live pictures to come for you, and I'll just tell you what you were watching there. That was the Archbishop of Montreal, Christian Lepine, as he led the family in the Lord's Prayer, and before that it was the pastor of the St. Patrick's Basilica. That's Monsignor Francis Coyle. Francis Coyle, the pastor. A special prayer because, bearing in mind, St. Patrick's is the main church for English-speaking Catholics in Montreal, but also the heart of the Irish community. This is Lent, of course, for Catholics, and the Easter season, the promise of Christian resurrection, and the Christian promise, and all of that made very clear to the family as they gather for private times. And I was looking and watching, and David Cochran will join me in a moment, but to hear the honor guard, the RCMP, the casket bearers, as they made sure that everything was in precision and just perfect, leading him from the hearse down through the sanctuary to the place where he will lie in repose for those next 2 days. And you saw there almost all of the family. Of course, the center of Brian Mulroney's world was his family, his wife Mila. We've spoken, of course, of the fact they were married for more than 50 years. They celebrated that not too long before his passing, 50 years since he met her in Montreal, famously when she was young and at a tennis club there in Montreal. The great partnership and love affair, and their 4 children, Caroline, her husband Andrew Lapham. We saw Ben, not his wife Jessica in those live pictures, but they were married in St. Patrick's in 2008. So a particular memory for him of happier family times. Mark and his wife Vanessa, and also Nicholas and his wife Katie, all there to support their mother-in-law, as they grieve together again. But they've talked about how the public support and the stories they've learned about their husband and father have been so energizing for them, that they've learned so much even about their father, and they continue to welcome Canadians who want to pay respects. We're going to see that, of course, over the next couple of days as he lies in repose in Montreal. I want to bring in, again, we've talked about friends, we've talked about colleagues, we've talked about associates. My next guest has a very particular connection to Brian Mulroney. at a very particular point in his life, but he has many things to talk about and his many accomplishments. And I'm just so delighted to invite to the program really a preeminent appellate and trial advocate, a senior counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais. This is Guy Pratt. And Guy, welcome to our program. I'm so happy to have you as part of our special coverage today.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for inviting me.
It's such a sad occasion to have you with me, of course, and I know you've known Brian Mulroney for many years, and you've been watching the earlier coverage, watching that funeral cortege arrive and all of that ceremony, the emotion of the moment. What are some of your reflections, Guy?
Well, first of all, I must say it's hard to watch. I'm having trouble checking my emotions, as I did yesterday when I went to pay my own respects to the family, whom I'll see again on the weekend. Mr. Mulroney was, as many of your guests have said, referring to various facets of his career and life, an extraordinary human being. And I was remarkably lucky to connect with him at a point in his career that was a challenge. But through that, I learned to love and admire, I think, one of the greatest leaders this country has ever had, and one whose accomplishments can compare with the greatest leaders around the world of our time and previous time. So to see him now honored by all sorts of Canadians. I waited in line like everyone else yesterday. All sorts of Canadians who may not have had a personal connection to him, as I was privileged to do, but nevertheless acknowledging his incredible life professionally and his family too, an immense success that he managed to pull out with Mrs. Mulroney, who is an extraordinary person in her own right, as each of their 4 children is as well.
I didn't mention the 16 grandchildren, and I should have, because they lit up his life too, of course. I want to talk about that phase in his life, and I'll get to that, Guy, if I could. Talking about, Guy Pratt represented Brian Mulroney during the Oliphant Commission, the inquiry into the Airbus affair, and that, as I said, was a particular window into that moment and that part of Brian Mulroney's legacy. But your connection, firstly, is a family one, and it involves your father, who was Dean of Law at Laval University when one young student named Brian Mulroney was there. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, actually, my father was a lawyer in Quebec City, had his own law firm, but he ended up being the last part-time dean of Laval Law School when Mr. Mulroney, I think in about 62 or 63, came to the law school. And it was quite interesting because even in those days, they had pseudonyms for exams, but Mr. Mulroney would write his exams in English, and everyone knew that it was him writing these exams. But he was also, and I did a podcast with him last year, actually. We reviewed basically every phase of his career. And he described Laval at a historic time in Quebec's, in Canada's history, effervescent, the new quiet revolution, the progress of the university to include social sciences, and he was right in the middle of that. And I think he invited Mr. Diefenbaker to speak at the law school. He had politics in his blood, Mr. Mulroney did, at that time. And thereafter, my father and Mr. Mulroney continued to connect, because when Mr. Mulroney was a lawyer and then president of Iron Ore, he hired my father to advise him, and also as Prime Minister of Canada, he did as well. So when I
connections.
Yeah, indeed.
It's I was thinking about when you talk about Laval, that was where really he talked about how Quebec's perspective became his perspective, although he remained a federalist, and he was such an ardent supporter of John Diefenbaker until he thought that he never really got the Quebec issue and what was happening in Quebec, what needed to be understood. So there was a break there, and of course, the beginning of his own political philosophy. At that time, when he was hiring your father and working with him, did you know him personally? He must have been aware of your growing legal reputation.
Well, no, my father died actually in 1988, just at the time that Mr. Mulroney got his second mandate, and in the fight over free trade and the GST. So actually, it was only about 20 years after that I had acted with Mr. Mulroney, when I was then in Ottawa. And my father actually had opposed my moving to Ottawa. He thought I was starting to practice law in Toronto. He thought I was making an egregious mistake. And I'll never forget, I had a dinner with Mr. Mulroney after the inquiry, and I was telling him that my father thought I had made a mistake by going to Ottawa, but wondered what he would say now that he had known that I was acting for Mr. Mulroney, as he had himself. So maybe he would have forgiven me for that move.
That full circle moment, because let's talk about that for a moment. You know, it seems hard to believe it dominated the headlines for so many years, but there may be some who don't remember the Airbus affair and the whole accusation of Brian Mulroney's pushing Canada to buy Airbus airplanes for Air Canada. And it led to the inquiry, the Oliphant inquiry, Justice Oliphant, Jeffrey Oliphant, a lot of testimony, the image that remains in the minds of so many, those envelopes stuffed with cash, the $225,000 cash in those envelopes. He always denied the wrongdoing, but acknowledged the money and called it a serious error of judgment. I'm just wondering, as you've said, a low point in Brian Mulroney's life and career. What did you learn about him in that context?
Well, you used the word context. I always thought that, as I said actually at the end of this commission of inquiry, every person's life is a bit like a canvas, and it has to be judged in the entire context. Mr. Mulroney's life had a very big canvas, and no canvas is perfect. Not all brushstrokes are perfect. And in his case, there was that mistake, which he acknowledged. But you have to stand back and look at the entire canvas. And when you do that, as Canadians are doing now, I think properly so, when you look at the entire context, it's a remarkable life. Politically, the achievements are incomparable. But also, you know, that's the foreground of what we see, his political career. But he was an extraordinarily successful lawyer before that, very successful business person. But in the background, as you've noted, a remarkable family man, yes, but also a friend. I mean, he, for me, and I know there are countless Canadians and probably people from abroad also who received these calls that my friend Mr. Fortier talked about, well after I'd acted for him, where he would inquire about my wife's health, which had been a big challenge. And he did that many times. Yes. And after I couldn't do anything for him, it was just in his genes and in his blood to love people and to want to help them and prop them up. And I saw one of your reporters talk about his popularity on the streets of Montreal. I saw this well after he was Prime Minister. We'd go to a lunch or something, come out, and people would just come up to him and start talking to him, and you could see that it would just lift his spirits as he would lift theirs. There was something in him, maybe a bit like President Clinton, that connected with anybody. There was no arrogance in Mr. Mulroney. He just loved people. And I think that was the big motivator in his life.
Monsieur Perret, just bear with me for a moment. I just want people to know what they're seeing, because now we've seen the honor guard take its position. So he will be accompanied at all times during these 2 hours of lying of repose. These are sentinels from the Canadian Armed Forces, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There's a vigil party commander. There is a sentinel waiting, and we will see them there at each of the corners of his casket. They will rotate. Every 30 minutes, there will be a change there. You see the casket draped in the flag. You see Mr. Mulroney's Canadian honors as well as they are displayed. And I believe we're starting to see some of the dignitaries arrive, one of whom I'll just highlight when we see him, and I'll be back to Guy Pratt for sure, but is Pierre-Carl Pelledeau, who will be eulogizing Brian Mulroney on Saturday in the state funeral. So if we see him there approach the casket, Guy, I will perhaps interrupt. You mentioned your closing remarks before that committee, and I was rereading them. The 20-minute speech you made to Justice Oliphant, personal at times, emotional at times, trying to sort of, as it was characterized then, appeal to his sense of fairness, because you said it's a judgment that will, to a large extent, define a person's reputation, which, as the Supreme Court of Canada says, is the most precious asset that anyone has. I bet you could recite that back to me. I'm sure you remember what you said. It was, I'm sure, such a landmark moment. But on the point of reputation, you kind of alluded to that. There certainly seems to be a nostalgia on the part of the people who are coming out to pay respects. What do you think is now Brian Mulroney's reputation and how he's viewed now?
Well, I think you heard that from many people. His reputation is outstanding. You know, there is not a single leader that I know of that is now admired. Take Churchill, who is someone Mr. Mulroney admired very much, who didn't have great imperfections. Anyone who's read any biography of Churchill would find that there were lots of flaws in Winston Churchill. But you don't judge a person by the one flaw that is exposed to public scrutiny, particularly in our day and age, in ways that wouldn't have been in Mr. Churchill's time. You don't judge anybody by just that one flaw. It has to be put in context, as you were saying. And from that perspective, it's self-evident that Mr. Mulroney, one was the greatest prime ministers we ever had. And there's another quality I'd like to underscore from, because we all know his achievements, but the way he did it, the civility, a very rare commodity these days, unfortunately, one that is noted in Steve Pakin's book on John Turner, and they had fierce debates, Mr. Turner and Mr. Mulroney, but there was civility in all of his dealings with his political opponents and with anyone he dealt with. And that is, to my mind, is almost something that transcends his actual achievements, because he achieved these things while doing it in a very civil, proper way. And as I say, to me, that is one of the great qualities that he has, that defines his reputation.
Civility, I'm thinking, you had a choice, sir. Even at that fierce moment in that 1984 debate, as you say, civility ringing through. So I know, I'm speaking to you in Ottawa, you will be in Montreal on Saturday for the state funeral, and this is given perhaps a little bit of a flavor. It's not in this basilica, but it will be solemn and beautiful, of course, on Saturday in Notre Dame Basilica. What do you think will be a fitting tribute? What do you hope is the tribute to someone you knew in so many different respects?
Well, I think, a number of us, like Mr. Fortier, were honorary pallbearers for this, and there's a large number of people who will honor him. There are a number of people who will speak. You mentioned Mr. Pelado, and I assume, including obviously Mr. Caroline, I assume that they will go through his achievements, not only as a politician, but as a man, as a human being who had extraordinary courage. He had the courage to lose. The things he took on, like the GST, free trade, apartheid, and fighting over this with Mrs. Thatcher. He had the courage to lose. And so I'm sure that all of those facets, Mr. Baker is going to speak, James Baker, all of those facets will be outlined. And I hope that Canadians will watch that, and once they've listened to all of those perspectives, come to the judgment, which I've come to, which is to say that we lost an extraordinary man of achievement, but a human being, a friend, a family man of, as you've noted, the 50-plus years marriage with Mila Mulroney, an incredible life, and one that we should celebrate, and we should be so proud of this statesman that Canada should just wish for more of that in the future, because he is a model, I think, for many to emulate.
I don't think I should ask one more question. That seems like the perfect note on which to conclude, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your sharing memories, but also insight and assessment. Thanks so much, Guy Pratt. Thank you for coming in and being part of our show today.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much. So Guy Pratt in Ottawa, as we look again live inside St. Patrick's Basilica. And this is a place, and you see the family now arriving, and they will, as they did for 2 days of lying in state in Ottawa, they will be greeting the mourners, the dignitaries, first of all, from 10:30 through until 12 noon, and from 12 noon until 6 p.m. today, 10 until 6 tomorrow, Canadians who line up outside St. Patrick's and want to file in front of that casket to pay respects. I want to just, again, highlight what we're seeing. There is the casket, the honor guard, the portrait of Brian Mulroney, a photo there, the beautiful flowers. And right now, let's just pause on this. This is Lucien Bouchard, Brian Mulroney's friend from law school, Université Laval, 1960s. They were friends forever. It was Lucien Bouchard who was with him when he got into politics, very helpful in his early years. And then in the years of the Mulroney government from 1984, his environment minister, his Quebec lieutenant, they had a shared vision of Quebec, and he was very much at Mulroney's side as Mulroney tried to bring Quebec into the Constitution and make sure that Quebec was at that table. And then, of course, we know what happened thereafter, which is when Meech did not succeed. It was a humiliation in Lucien Bouchard's view, and there was a personal split and an end to their friendship of 30 years. only reconciled just recently before Brian Mulroney's death. And it's been very poignant to see Lucien Bouchard on television, notably on French television, talking about those years gone and how you can never have them back and what a heartbreak that was, but also talking about how he sees, had Meech Lake succeeded, how much things would be different today in terms of federal-provincial relations. I'm going to talk about that with David Cochrane a little bit later on, but I want to go just outside quickly again to Sarah Levitt. We're watching some of the dignitaries and the invited guests arrive, Sarah, and I will highlight some of them as we see them, but you're watching, obviously. Anybody stopping to talk to you or get a sense of their feelings so far?
Well, I can tell you for now, most of the dignitaries, what they have done is said, we want to go inside, pay our respects before we come out and talk about Brian Mulroney. But we have seen several go inside, including former Bloc Québécois leader Gilles Duceppe, as well as former Quebec Premier Pierre-Marc Johnson going in to pay their respects. You mentioned that as well right now inside, Lucien Bouchard. And also here is Québécois CEO Pierre-Cad Pelledo, who has called Mulroney his improbable mentor on the business side of things. That's because Brian Mulroney, of course, was chairman of Québécois. The two men worked closely together. These are just some of the dignitaries. And you know, Heather, that earlier David Cochrane was talking about the family and what they've been doing, and that's standing and listening and receiving people for hours while they're in mourning. An important thing to do, no doubt, and Marc Mulroney saying that it's not easy. They've just lost their father, but something that kind of gives him some sense of relief is hearing all the stories that they've been hearing over these past couple of days in Ottawa and what they'll hear here in Montreal, learning new things about their father that they hadn't heard before as well. No doubt that's going to continue as these dignitaries and friends of the family make their way into the church. And then this afternoon, of course, there's the members of the public that can come and pay their respects.
Sarah, thank you. I'll be back to you in just a moment as we look at the live picture. This is Pierre-Marc Johnson, and Sarah was mentioning him. For a brief period of time, the Premier of Quebec, as was his brother, Daniel Johnson. His brother was the leader at the time of the Quebec referendum. And as we look at these pictures and looking at Lucien Bouchard, I'm just going to bring in David Cochrane as we do so. So struck by that, David, on my reporting and journalism journey, I was in Montreal for many years. I wasn't the political correspondent, but at that time. There was no other story than the political story in 1995, the referendum. And Lucien Bouchard, of course, I mean, Parizeau was the leader of the party, but Lucien Bouchard was the motivator behind the side, the souverainist, the independent side, and came within a hair's breadth, of course, of winning that referendum in 1995, about half a percentage point, less than 1%. And watching him, and here he is here. Oh, this is how fortuitous. I watch him, and I think, David, because of course he left federal politics, he'd gone to form the Bloc, he was the formal opposition leader, such an adversarial relationship with his longtime great friend, but went to provincial politics and ended up being so sick with flesh-eating disease. And I was outside that hospital, David, as he sent that famous note. Do you remember that handwritten note? Que l'on continue, carry on, in the cause that he was fighting for after his split from Brian Mulroney. So this is poignant, David, watching this. Again, close friends, bitter foes for decades, only to reconcile. And I'm interested in your thoughts on Lucien Bouchard, perhaps in all of this, but also maybe on the thought Bouchard was talking in the interviews after Mr. Mulroney's death about what might have been different in terms of had Meech gone through, and the things that you talk about all the time on power and politics, the areas of division of powers for the provinces and the federal government. In his view, you know, they would be long settled. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting just to speak to the moment we're seeing right now. This is a moment that I was live on the air when the news broke of the passing of Brian Mulroney. And this is a moment that many people thought would not happen because it was not widely known on February 29th when Brian Mulroney passed away that him and Lucien Bouchard had begun this reconciliation process. Because, you know, people speaking about Brian Mulroney and his generosity and his kindness also talk about his Irish nature, and I can say that as a guy whose roots go back to that country, and his ability to hold grudges. And there was a thought that he might never reconcile with Lucien Bouchard, and there we see Jean Charest, another important figure in Quebec politics and national politics. Heather walking in, he's going to be one of the eulogizers on Saturday.
And watching him, now that is extraordinary, their connections. They go back so far. We'll come back to the Bouchard story, but Jean Charest, who considered Brian Mulroney really, in essence, as a second father. A junior minister in his government, the first government in 1984. And then after 93, David, of course, in the collapse of the Progressive Conservative Party, just 2 seats in the 1993 election, he eventually took over as the leader until he was drafted to become the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party, and he left the federal scene too to go to provincial politics. But the ties to this family, and he has talked just so movingly. He had seen Brian Mulroney in Florida just a few days before his death, but was very shocked, obviously, as so many were. And he talked about how he was a mentor, a friend, a confidant, supported everything that he did in his life, both politically and elsewhere. And he talked about how he had the ambition to change Canada for the better. So maybe that's something that we'll hear in terms of the eulogy on Saturday. Talk more about the relationship with Jean Charest as you have studied it and followed it and what you've heard in the recent days.
Well, just on that point you made there, Heather, about the vision to make Canada better. One of the stories we heard during the tributes in the House of Commons from the current Prime Minister was that Brian Mulroney said to him that history will judge you on the big ticket items. You know, taking the big swings and trying to accomplish big things. And you see that with the conversations about free trade, for example, the GST, acid rain, the Montreal Protocol. But also as you look at Jean Charest, and we've just seen Lucien Bouchard, you go back to the attempts to try to reconcile the Quebec question with English Canada and with the Constitution. And the challenges and failures of both the Meech Lake Accord and Charlottetown, and the knock-on and unintended consequences of both of those efforts. You know, Lucien Bouchard suggested that had that passed, it could have settled a lot of the challenges. You remember in 1987, Elijah Harper standing with an eagle feather in the Manitoba legislature, you know, or shortly after 1987, refusing to allow this to go through. Because Meech Lake had been drawn up without the consultation and input of First Nations and Indigenous people. And then that led to the Newfoundland legislature under then Premier Clyde Wells canceling a vote because of deep concerns under Premier Wells, a Liberal, on what it would mean for division of powers. The very questions, you know, Quebec wanted settled would have had knock-on tensions in other places.
David, just pause, if you would, as we look at this from on high. That is Gilles Duceppe, of course, the former leader of the Bloc as well. And it's just so interesting to watch the Mulroney family greet those who've been leaders in the sovereignty movement. It was Brian Mulroney's view and aim to bring Quebec to the table politically. He was unsuccessful in that, but as I was mentioning, he viewed Quebec's priorities as his, not, though, to the point of becoming part of sovereignty. That's Pierre Bruneau, a longtime anchor in the province of Quebec as well on the French network side of things. I want to bring Sarah in back again because she is a very special guest for us. This morning, someone we will hear at length on Saturday in the eulogies to Brian Mulroney. Sarah.
Heather, I'm with Pierre Cade-Pelledo, CEO and president of Quebecor. Of course, he knew Brian Mulroney well. It's been said that he was an improbable mentor for you. Can you tell me what that means?
Well, I would say probable, not improbable, because Mr. Mulroney was very close to the family. For in fact, he negotiated the first labor agreement of Le Journal de Montréal. He was a lawyer here at Ogilvy-Renault, and my father used his talent to negotiate this. And in fact, that's a good idea, because he considered that when you negotiate something, you need to be fair, you need to be equitable to everyone. And I guess that this is what the labor agreement of Le Journal Montréal was at the beginning and for the rest. So I think he was really involved in things that for him, will take his consideration and making sure that everybody, will be happy out of a transaction. So no, I would say it's a probable mentor because he helped me a lot while we bought the Vidéotron. In my father's time was Le Journal de Montréal and other things, and in my time then was the purchase of Vidéotron and issues that we've been facing because it was not always easy. Life is not always has a very calm river. Sometimes it's rocky and bumpy, and he was there. Mr. Mulroney was Mr. Loyalty. Mr. Loyalty was there to support. He never gave up, and he will be someone who will never going to be able to replace him as the chairman of the board, as a board member. He was there all the time, and we will miss him very much.
We're hearing a lot about Brian Mulroney as Prime Minister, his political career, but he had business acumen as well, and that's the side that you saw. What for you is the lasting memory of Mulroney?
He was always there, I was having conversation, a few days before he passed away, and he was, considering, putting himself in good shape for the next annual meeting that will come in spring, and this is what Mr. Mulroney was all about. He would support the company. He will be there to help. We will have fun also with him. Never a dull moment with him. This is certainly, what Mr. Mulroney was all about. So, no doubt, his business acumen had been there. He was involved in the legal world at the beginning, and then he became, a manager, the CEO of a large mining group here before, he went to politics. But, I guess that, business was important also in politics for him because he would consider, this is my perspective, that if you want to build a strong economy that will be able to be shared between as much as citizens as possible, then therefore you need to have a strong corporation for having better jobs, paying more income tax to be able, to be shared with social efforts that will bring, as a nation, more people to get richer.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Peladeau.
Pleasure.
So, of course, Heather, he will be there on Saturday giving one of the eulogies at the funeral.
Thank you so much for that. I was struck because we know Brian Mulroney was a major force in two generations of Peladeau's. He helped his father, the founder of Québecor in the late 60s, Pierre Peladeau, helped him build the company and then worked with, as was so clear there, with Pierre-Carl Peladeau to transform it into the dominant company it is right now. The statement, he talked about his sound counsel that played an important role in Quebecor's growth and its present-day success, and many other Quebec business leaders would say the same. So important in elevating Quebec business and Quebec successes and Quebecers on the international scene, but certainly business. Let's come back to Brian Mulroney, again, the live shots as the family greets dignitaries and invited guests, obviously very warmly. As people arrive, we had a representative from the city of Montreal earlier. We saw Paul Tellier, who was someone Yves Fortier highlighted, mentioning how good he was to Paul Tellier's wife and would remember her all the time when he worked for him as secretary in the Privy Council. Paul Tellier, in his tribute to Brian Mulroney after his death, said he was the best boss that I ever had. So as we continue to watch these live pictures, and there is the representative from the city of Montreal just stepping down, the mayor Valérie Plante has also heralded Brian Mulroney as a great and leading statesman and someone of pride in Montreal. He was very proud of Montreal, loved Quebec, but boy, did he love Nova Scotia. And wow, did he ever love St. Francis Xavier University. Richard Isner is with me. He's the director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. Bears his name in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. I don't think I've undersold that, have I, sir? The ties between the university, of course, where he did his undergraduate work broadly, but then, of course, specifically the pride, this jewel, the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
No, you haven't sold it at all, Heather. And thanks for having me on and having a segment of your show dedicated to the relationship that Mr. Mulroney, former Prime Minister, had with St. Francis Xavier University and the instrumental role, the visionary role he played in creating the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government at St. FX. And his involvement with this university has been, I would say, close to a lifelong involvement relationship that has, covered the bulk of his life, and we've benefited, and our students have benefited from it.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you bring Brian Mulroney's approach to government, his vision, his leadership, how you incorporate that into what you teach at the school?
Yeah, so one of the things Mr. Mulroney always said consistently after his time leaving St. FX was the profound effect that this university had on him. As a young man coming from Quebec to Nova Scotia, a very different part of the country that he was used to. I came from a small town, but this is a small town, and so that was a nice fit. And the impact that the education he received here as a young man, as an undergraduate student, had on him as he went on to careers in law and business, and then later in politics, of course. And he wanted to make sure that in his efforts in interacting with this university, that he would hopefully increase the opportunities for our students to continue to benefit from that kind of liberal arts and science education that he received, in the hopes that some of our additional students or future students would also have the opportunity to become leaders, including potentially prime minister. And that was very much at the forefront of his vision for creating the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. So as part of that, we've created one of the only undergraduate public policy and governance programs in Canada. And we teach our students a broad range of skills in that program. They learn about public finance, they learn about how to do public policy analysis, but they also get the opportunity to get into some thematic issues like environmental policy or Indigenous policy, or in my area, science and technology policy and environmental policy. And all of these areas, of course, were very important to Mr. Mulroney and his policy agenda. But they learn about ideas from across the political spectrum and policy spectrum as well. And that was also an important part of his vision, is that our work here was not going to be partisan in any way. It was going to be distinctly nonpartisan. So we learn about all kinds of ideas.
When you talk about his political vision, I just want to highlight what's happening live on the screen. And we're seeing right now with Ben Mulroney, that is Pierre-Carl Pelledeau from Quebecor, who will be eulogizing Brian Mulroney on Saturday. He was just speaking with Sarah and talking about his influence, that improbable mentor. And he is part of this group of dignitaries talking to the Mulroney family members. You see Caroline there saying merci beaucoup, thank you to those who've come to pay tribute to her father. And she too will eulogize her father on Saturday. You can see how they're keeping them in certain groups at a time so that each of these people can have a few moments with the Mulroney family. Richard, I'm wondering, the last visit, as I understand it, that Brian Mulroney paid, he was so close to the school, and I believe would visit often, but just last year, 2023, he was there. What do you remember of that visit and the lasting sort of memory on campus?
Yeah, it was a very special visit, I have to say, and I had the great privilege of being intimately involved in the efforts to organize the first Atlantic Economic Forum here at St. Francis Xavier, hosted by the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. And the reason for organizing that conference was directly linked to Mr. Mulroney's legacy in creating the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, the first of what is now a national network of regional economic development organizations that have stood the test of time. It's part of Mr. Mulroney's policy legacy. And in bringing together business, policy, government, industry leaders, leading thinkers on economic development from across the region. It was really a special event and an opportunity for Mr. Mulroney to return and engage in that conversation on a topic that he himself started many years ago when he worked with Donald Savoie at the University of Moncton to create the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. For me personally, it was thrilling to have him here and to see him speak. And I had never had the opportunity to see him speak in person the way he spoke at that event, and he was incredibly powerful. You could just see the magic happening in his opening speech introducing Prime Minister Trudeau at that event. It was incredible. I still get goosebumps thinking about it.
And we are as well, just hearing about it as we watch. Richard, it's been a half an hour now since the dignitaries began paying respects, and this is what we will see on the half hour. The changing out of those, the Sentinels, the RCMP members, the Canadian Armed Forces members, who will stand guard, who will not leave that decorated casket for these 2 days of Brian Mulroney lying in repose. Richard, you're kind to give us time. I know you have meetings this morning. Do I have time for one more question, or do you need to go?
No, sure, Heather. Go ahead.
I just want people to know, and I don't know if we'll be able to show these pictures because we really don't want to take our eyes off what is happening in St. Patrick's, but people who come to where you are, there's a replica, is there not? And even online you can take the virtual tour of the Brian Mulroney Prime Minister's office and his desk and the surroundings for him during his years as leader of this country.
Yeah, it's a really special part of our university and an incredible effort by Mr. Mulroney to help us in creating what's known as Mulroney Hall here at St. FX in Antigonish. And I'd encourage all of your viewers to, if they have a chance, if they're in Nova Scotia, come and visit. It's an incredible, unique building, unlike any other building that I've seen at universities across Canada, and I've been to many. It has a replica office of the Prime Minister's office, and it's set up exactly as it was when Mr. Mulroney was the Prime Minister. But it has a number of other showpiece items. There are places where people can watch videos about policy debates in the House of Commons. There are artifacts from Mr. Mulroney's time as Prime Minister, and there are many on display. And the walls carry the policy story and the career story of Mr. Mulroney from his time as a student at St. FX through his formative years when he became a politician, and his policy legacy are basically laid out on the walls of Mulroney Hall. It's very interesting and it's educational. So I'd encourage all your viewers to come and have a look if they get a chance.
One person I'm looking out for as guests and friends and longtime associates pay respects to Brian Mulroney is your president. I guess given the connection and the deep one, Sean Riley, the president of St. FX, is among those invited to pay respects today. Why was it important, do you think, Richard, to have, right at the top, but have that very visible connection and the tribute being paid today?
Well, I think that Mr. Mulroney and his family had a special connection with many people at St. FX, including former President Sean Riley and our current president, Dr. Andy Haken. And so they will be in attendance at the state funeral on Saturday, as will I, and a couple of others from St. FX who worked closely with Mr. Mulroney in developing Mulroney Hall, but also in fundraising for our efforts to create scholarships for students and research awards for students and all of the programming that happens at the Mulroney Institute of Government as a result of his generosity and the support of many people who wanted to honor Mr. Mulroney in creating this program and at St. FX.
Apologies to the current president. We have current and former in attendance as well. Listen, thank you so much. I will watch for him and for them. And of course, I'm sure during the eulogies over the weekend, we'll hear plenty of references to St. FX, such a an important aspect of his life, and as we've learned very clearly this morning from Richard, this is a tie that he was most proud of and cultivated most assiduously. Thank you very much, Richard. Richard Isner, the director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government there at St. FX in Antigonish. I'm going to bring in David Cochran on Antigonish in just a moment, but David, before I get to you, Sarah, outside St. Patrick's, speaking to some of the dignitaries and invited guests, including Lucien Bouchard, speaking both in French and also some comments in English. Let's listen to those.
A reopening would happen. It did happen. And those were great times, but sad at the same time because we had lost so much time. And you can't help thinking, if we would go back then, maybe it would be a bit better to manage this thing, you know. But we are young, ego, strong convictions from very legitimate question at stake. So it's a lesson. Politics is necessary, but there's also the necessity to deal with it in a human way. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, some brief reflection, David Cochran, on exactly what we were talking about. And you can hear the regret, can't you? What a heartbreak. Close friends from their time at law school at Laval built the political coalition Le Beau Risque, that brought in Quebec nationalists into the Mulroney coalition that propelled him, and nobody's done it since, but propelled him to that huge majority in 1984. Those who've come after have tried to replicate that, have not been successful. But then after Meech and its failure, as I said, his view that it was a humiliation yet again for Quebec at the constitutional table, and he left the Progressive Conservatives. He eventually formed the Bloc Québécois. He became the leader of the opposition party, went to provincial politics, such a role in that 1995 referendum, the premier of the province too, and all those years not at all in contact with his great friend from those many, many years ago. And then you hear, you know, it was ego, politics are hard, but I wish we could have managed it differently. What did you hear, David, in the tone, perhaps, or the substance of Lucien Bouchard there?
I heard the wisdom and regret of age, you know, speaking about being young, political, and stubborn. And that's when grudges and calluses form that take a long time to heal. And, you know, going back to what we were saying earlier, on February 29th, when we learned of the news of Brian Mulroney's passing, we did not think there had been a reconciliation. We did not necessarily know. And we learned over the coming hours that, in fact, several months prior to that, it had begun. And there was a wistfulness in some of the commentary we heard from Lucien Bouchard after Mulroney's passing had been confirmed, about the lost time and the lost opportunity and the wishing they had more time to reconnect and recalibrate after all those years of grudge and anger and separation. And you hear this, it's an interesting lesson in that you know, and going back to your conversation with Mr. Pratt earlier about civility missing in politics right now, this sort of reaching across the aisle and maintaining friendships and things that punctuate the stories about Brian Mulroney. Don't know if we're going to hear a lot of that about the current generation of politics. I think a lot of the grudges and divisions are baked in and a feature of the way things operate. But to hear Mr. Bouchard there speaking with that lament about what had been, that's an interesting thing to hear really at a time like this.
I've been thinking about this a lot. It was really quite striking to see on French television M. Bouchard and Jean Charest in the same panel, because Jean Charest was forever close to Brian Mulroney and someone who viewed him as a second father, and then his close friend, and then coming back together. And it was interesting, you know, again, another comment, and further to what he was just saying, we felt very strongly for what we thought and fought for, so it can explain things. This is what he said at one point. But at the end of the day, it was a lot of years lost. We were close. Again, that's a reference to Meech and the fact that he thinks that things would have been much better if the outcome had been different then. David, come back to me as we look again at the family. This is Mila Mulroney as she continues to greet invited guests and dignitaries. I just will say, as we watch too, because we get various shots of the whole family there, that at a certain point, yes, you're seeing all 4 of the children and most of the spouses, but we're also, in some cases, not Jessica, who's Ben's wife, but there's also one of the grandchildren, Caroline's daughter, Miranda, one of their children, is there as well. 16 grandchildren, and the light of Brian Mulroney's life. And many of his friends have recollected in our coverage, and I'm sure in yours too, David, never wanting to miss a hockey game or always wanting to find out about whether, the school exam or to be part of their lives to the extent that he could. And they called him Papa. And that was the role that his children have said he was so proud of. Again, as we watch this, as the dignitaries arrive, the family, a lot of emotion, certainly, and the vigil party guarding that casket. Again, coming back to Saturday and what we'll hear in the eulogies, and I was mentioning likely some reference to St. FX. What were you, as you were listening into Richard's comment in the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government, how important that was to him? So you've been thinking a little bit about his ties to Nova Scotia. Of course, he was first elected there in 1983, but real ties to the East.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you talking there about the replica of his office that exists at the institute that bears his name. Going back to the story I was telling earlier that Prime Minister Trudeau told in the tributes in the House of Commons, that's where the conversation happened between the current Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister, if I'm remembering this story correctly, about Mulroney saying history will judge you on the big ticket items, on the big things that you try to do. So here you have the son of a Prime Minister who is a current Prime Minister speaking to a former Prime Minister in the replica of that Prime Minister's office about the lessons and motivations that should guide you as you hold the country's highest elected office. So it's interesting that that happened at St. Francis Xavier, but also, Heather, I have a couple of panelists on my show on Friday. Fred Delory, who's a conservative political organizer, and Greg McEachern, who's worked for Liberal ministerial staffers. They're both proud alumni of St. FX. They wear the rings every day. And they were struck by the passing of Mr. Mulroney and were there with him. And one of the things they told me is that he was making plans to get ready to come back for the spring convocation, to be part of the ceremony at the university later this year. And we spoke to Bonnie Brownlee about that when she was sitting with me and Rosemary Barton on TV the other day. She's, of course, has worked for the Mulroney family, a longtime personal friend. And she made the point that, yeah, he was making plans to do those things because they all thought they had more time. That, he was dealing with cancer and other health issues, but it was a fall in Florida that really accelerated us to this moment. But they had hoped and planned that they had more time and were making plans to do the things at the important places in their lives, like St. FX. And that struck me listening to Lucien Bouchard about, you think you have time to do things, you think you have time to fix things, until suddenly you don't. And so all of these things that have been left undone and planned to be done, life has a way of moving more quickly than I think people are ready for.
You know, David, Jean Charest has talked about in interviews that he saw him, expected that wouldn't be the last time, and he too, although he would have seen his friend failing, didn't believe that he would be gone as he passed away on the 29th of February. We're going to hear some of Jean Charest. He's certainly been speaking often. He will eulogize Brian Mulroney on Saturday, but he's talked about the vision of his friend and mentor. In 1984, when Brian Mulroney was first elected, so was Jean Charest. He was 28. He was the youngest cabinet minister in the country at that time. Lifelong friends. They share the vision. Of course, Jean Charest trying to win the leadership and again, turning to Brian Mulroney for help in that regard. But let's listen to Jean Charest as he spoke to our Sarah Levitt.
So I'll make a short statement, but I'm not going to take any questions. This is a very sad moment, but it's also beautiful in some ways as the country pauses to think and reflect upon the heritage of Brian Mulroney and what he's given to the country and his leadership and what we as a country have accomplished. So these moments in the life of Canada are important, and I sincerely hope that a lot of Canadians will take a moment to stop and reflect and think about what we've built together and the very important role that Brian Mulroney has played. Merci beaucoup, beaucoup. Thank you for being patient.
Jean Charest, just like Brian Mulroney, completely bilingual and bicultural, adopting his vision of the country, and in so many ways highlighting the vision of his friend and mentor. And David, we're going to carry on with coverage. Abby Kugathausen is going to take over in just a couple of minutes as we will continue, of course, to watch what's happening there in St. Patrick's. But some closing thoughts as you watch this, as you have in Ottawa. We're just beginning 2 days of repose in Montreal. What do you want to leave us with?
Well, two things I'm wondering about, having just heard from Jean Charest, the enormous pressure to give a eulogy for a man renowned for his ability to give eulogies. Brian Mulroney gave tremendous eulogies for two U.S. presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Bush. You know, he spoke at Nancy Reagan's funeral, reading a letter that Ronald Reagan had written to her earlier in their relationship. He gave the eulogy at John Crosby's funeral in St. John's a few years back, and he's just a tremendous orator, which set such an enormously high standard. So everyone who has to speak on Saturday, living up to that is going to be an enormous challenge, though I'm sure someone like Jean Charest has the capabilities to try to do that. The other thing I think about is here in federal politics, Brian Mulroney's been gone from elected life for a long, long time. And anybody who serves as a prime minister that long and tries to do the things that he did leaves a mixed and complicated legacy. But when the country needed him in 2016 after Donald Trump was elected and Justin Trudeau reached out to him to help save the NAFTA negotiations, and a progressive conservative prime minister who came in on the heels, ran against the legacy of Justin Trudeau's father in many ways, helped the son, vouched for him in U.S. political circles with Republicans, saying you can talk to this guy, he'll help you, he'll get a good deal, and stood up to help Canada. I wonder who does that now, the next time, the next challenge faced like that. Who is the former elder statesman who can step into that and breezily move back and forth across national, international, and party lines? That's a gap that I don't think there's an obvious person to fill right now. And that is going to be an interesting thing to watch going forward as we face the prospect of another seismic change in U.S. politics and the Canada-U.S. relation. Who could be the person, if there is another Trump administration, that this government can turn to, or the next government can turn to, depending on what happens in our own election cycle? That's a big unanswered question right now as we watch the country and the family say goodbye to Brian Mulroney.
Thank you, David. We'll look forward to the coverage on the weekend. Again, as we've been watching the live coverage, Caroline Mulroney said in an interview with La Presse how lucky she was to have had him as a father. She'll be paying tribute on Saturday. And this morning and through this day, we've listened to tributes as leader, as visionary, as global statesman. Our coverage will continue. Your recollection will continue as Brian Mulroney lies in repose.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
If you spent 5 minutes with Brian Mulroney, you thought you had a new best friend.
Mr. Mulroney was Mr. Loyalty. Mr. Loyalty was there to support. He never gave up, and he will be someone who's never going to be able to replace him.